Hello again, book lovers. This book will change your life. They often used to say on books that spectacularly didn't change your life. Have any books really changed my life? Well, I suppose reading Nietzsche at an early age gave me a bit of a culture shock. And I would say Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate was a very powerful argument against the idea that all or almost all that we are comes from our culture rather than from our genetics. I suspect that the reason people resist this idea that we are genetically programmed for a lot of things is that it seems to take away our free will. That is a much knottier argument. Here, let us limit ourselves to the essence of today's reviewed book, which is Matt Ridley's The Origins of Virtue, and focus on the debate between Hobbesian and Rousseauian theories of where society came from. Hobbes would have it that we were all bashing each other over the head until society and government came. Rousseau would have it that we were living in a state of natural bliss before we invented things like laws, taxes, prisons. It's an interesting debate. And in my recent raiding of a bookshop, I bought David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, to be reviewed at a future date, in which the opposite point of view is put forward, initially as a direct response to Pinker's criticism of the blank slate. Now, I seem to find myself in some kind of dark triangle of evolutionary biologists. We've got Pinker coming from neuroscience, linguistics. We've got David Graeber coming from anthropology, and Matt Ridley also with background in genetics and anthropology. Who's right? Who's wrong? Well, I'll have to wait to see what Graeber and Wengrow say. Suffice to say that as this is a reread, A, I recommend it, and B, I didn't waste my time rereading it. The arguments are many and varied, and they try to show that the Hobbesian view is more correct, in inverted commas. I do suspect that in all this we get the a priori versus a posteriori knowledge debates, where in the end people say, well, it's a bit of both, wasn't it? And this is something I find a little incomprehensible about the reaction of, what should we say, extremely left-wing, extremely socialist, Marxist critics, who prefer to think that people are the products of their environment and can, therefore, be moulded by their environment. Twin studies are often ridiculed for not being a rigorous enough scientific experiment, but we can't really separate kids at birth and see what happens to them just to settle this debate. It's unethical, so we don't have a lot more apart from genetics. Now, the clever part of The Origin of Virtue is that Mr. Ridley leads us through a bit of genetic theory. We go from protozoa to slime molds, the ants and the... Oh, I should say, it starts off very well with the way that Kropotkin was sprung from prison. Kropotkin, another thinker that I admire. Mutual Aid, one of my favourite books. But Kropotkin was reacting against the idea that nature is a horrible place where everybody tears each other to pieces, to try to provide examples of where animals do cooperate and live in harmony, and then in the second part where humans cooperate. An interesting turning point in the book, in fact, is where the author flips the idea of the beehive and the ant colony as being magnificent examples of cooperative, selfless enterprise, as instanced by defenders of the Rousseauian view, for example, and explains exactly why workers are so selfless, precisely when explained via the lens of genetics, when we take the gene as the basic building block of the thing that wants to survive. Now, the argument, I suppose, from a philosophical point of view, is that of rational egotism. You behave in the way that is best for you, and very often that will mean becoming part of a society, or being likeable, behaving in a nice way to people. This is a philosophical strand that goes back through Max Stirner, The Ego and Its Own, all the way back to Nietzsche, which it keeps coming back to in the idea of the will to power. Now, there does seem to be a universal morality in the idea of helping other people and banding together and working as a team. And it's this that can give us the advantage over other animals. Imagine hunting a mammoth out on your own as compared to being with 10 or 20 other hunters who can chuck spears at it simultaneously from a safe distance, or you can corral it to a place where it will fall off the edge of a cliff and yum yum. Now, meat eating is a particularly interesting thing here because the meat will go off. There isn't any refrigerator. So how do you divide the meat up? Who gets the best cuts? Do you just give some away to people who haven't even partaken in the hunt, etc.? Well, there are myriad examples of these. Many of them of the type where we originally believed there was a selfless motive, but from the perspective of evolutionary biology, when we look at things with the idea that the gene will want to survive and replicate as a kind of base rule, then we get some interesting explanations. And there are a lot of stuff at the beginning about game theory, the prisoner's dilemma, mistakes that were made in trying to figure out how human beings calculate responses to situations. We're getting better and better at that. The beauty of it being that all leading, in this case, to a defence of capitalism. Mainly, I would have to put it like that. But of course, we don't call it capitalism, we call it free trade. Could this be the way, as Mr. Ridley argues, that we break out of our homogenous societies and learn to accept and trade and barter with people who are different from us? What are the rules about marrying out of the group, in the case of men or women? There seem to be some universals, but there also seem to be so many differences among the ways that people do things that we can get lost into thinking that it's purely because a person lives in the Amazon jungle that that person grows up the way they are. A couple of things I realised reading this. One, I'd forgotten most of it and most of the arguments, so it was a good refresher. And two, in my memory, the book began with Chief Seattle's eco speech, where he expressed confusion at the white man's idea that you could buy land. This isn't at the beginning, this is right near the end. And I remember that particularly as I was shocked by it. I don't like being lied to. Was Al Gore conscious of the fact that this speech was written in the 1970s? And certainly not based on anything that Chief Seattle actually said in the meeting, where, according to eyewitness reports, he just took the money and said thank you and went. 30 years later, there was a reconstruction of a hypothetical speech he might have made, and on the basis of that, we get some kind of flowery Wordsworthian Victorian sentimentalist moralising that I should have seen immediately was not from the mouth of a Red Indian chief from 200 years ago. And it's the fact that that idea was put forward by proponents of ecology, and I am an ecologist. I have to say this now, I'm a vegan, I've never owned a car, I don't travel much, I source locally, don't like plastic, etc., etc. I don't want us to chuck everything in the sea. I just want us to know what we're doing and what kind of people we are and what the best solution is. If you are, as we say these days, on the right, you will read this happily turning the pages and nodding your head sagely. If you are on the left, some questions will come to mind, but I would encourage you to read it, as it is a very cogent argument, very well marshalled, and it would be interesting to see which bits you disagree with, where and why. In summary, though, a very well argued case for right-wing politics, and again, this is a bit of a fudge because Mr. Ridley talks at many points on right-wing governments that have made the wrong decision, and he's certainly not a fan of the current Conservatives, for example. But by the end of it, you must think, well, agree or disagree, the guy definitely has a point.